She was at a disadvantage. Little was it known by her or anyone else around her, but Alpha already had a hold within her mind. That was a small part magic, of course. Her dreams were hardly hers, therefore her actions within them were controlled by her only when he desired it. Therefore it was in his power to manipulate her through walking her through actions that were not her own. It was a strategy that was most effective, and would be used at the most crucial of times. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist. Chapter 6. Dark Days for Us All. Bridget. More. "We need a plan," Alpha said softly, with his hand rubbing his chin. "We?" Bridget asked, looking around. She was in a dark cavern and stood knee-deep in a pool of thick, almost black blood. There was no entrance or exit to speak of, and the only light came from 2 torches on Bridget's left and right that burned a deep crimson red. The diameter of the room couldn't have been more than 10 meters, and the height wasn't that much greater. Alpha stood in front of Bridget, his bare back to her as he looked up at a rather grotesque sight. Levan hung from the walls and the ceiling by thorn-covered vines that wrapped around his arms in an eerie way that formed a sort of cross. He was dead. At least she hoped he was, and was covered in gashes, blood dripping from his toes, making soft splashes in the pool below. "Yes," Alpha growled, not turning around. "We." Bridget took a few cautious, sloshing steps towards him, wearing nothing but a coat of blood, as she had before in her dream. She started, not knowing how to finish. Her emotions were a tempest, and her soul told her that she was to do this man's bidding, regardless of the feelings of her heart. "I thought you'd have learned by now," he whispered softly as she grew closer, taking small steps, picking her way through the warm, thick pool. "What did you call upon in the heat of battle? What emotion did you feel?" "I was afraid," she whispered softly, joining him at his side. She thought she should have felt shame at her nakedness, but that emotion was as absent as her clothes. He growled, nodding his head and fixing her with a stare. "And after fear?" "Frustration," she said, breaking away from his gaze to stare at Levain's corpse. "Exasperation, anger, fury, hatred?" She almost growled, looking deeply into his animalistic eyes. "Fire," he whispered, his eyes alighting on the word. "Yes," she whispered, turning to face him. Her body acted involuntarily as he turned to face her and she placed her hands on his forearms. "Fire," she whispered, almost as an excited child would at the mention of a new toy. "You want more?" he asked, running a claw-like nail down the middle of her bare chest. "Yes," she whimpered with desire, disgusted to find that at least some small part of it was sexual. "Then have it," he said, opening his palm before her. It burned a radiant ruby red. "But know that your friends will pay the cost." She wanted to cry out, to beg him to stop, but the words would not come. Her body simply followed the desire of her soul as she put her hands to her side, and he placed his palm upon the previously left mark. She screamed, arching her back as an invisible force held her on her feet. All of her senses were replaced with fire. She smelled only smoke, tasted only soot, felt only heat, and saw only light. "Go now," Alpha said softly. "We shall have plans ready upon your return." Lyra was in the very unfortunate position of knowing that Aline was right. An attachment for Caden at this time wasn't what he needed. He needed to learn to stand on his own, for the day would come when his supports would abandon him either by choice or by fate. She remembered, though. She'd been through the process just a time more than Caden and was cursed with memory. How could she stand by and watch Caden when she'd already been with him and known that she, and he, wanted nothing else? Her love for him should have kept her away for his own sake, but her love for him did quite the opposite in the end. Time is precious, after all, and is so terrible to waste. And people? People are temporary. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist. Chapter 6, continued. Caden, is that in order? I dreamt of darkness and blood, of the screams and cries of those that longed for death. In that place there was no light, save for the fire that burned all. There was no known peace. There was no God. I had awoken as a bloody mess, covered in bandages and sore beyond reason and cold with fear. My only comfort was the feeling of Alira's thighs beside my head and her hand running through my hair. I had not seen fit to let her know that I was awake as she stroked softly, whispering the words, "It's all right. Shh." My fits must have been terrible while I slept. I didn't know how long it had been, nor did I truly wish to know. In point of fact, I wanted nothing more than to lie there and perhaps never rise. The music had taken me somewhere I did not know, and I did not know why it had come. The mere thought sending shivers through my body brought back a familiar metallic scent. Through far too Herculean an effort, I cast aside my fears. A leader had to be strong. Yet with Alira, I felt that I could be a bit more honest. I rolled over slowly and carefully, wincing slightly at the pain it brought as I looked up at Alira. She stared down at me with her crystal blue eyes. Her sharp features were not free of bruises and cuts, her right eye blackened and her right cheek bandaged. Her hair was loose, hanging down partially over her face, almost cascading down past her shoulders in dark blonde waves. "Good morning," she whispered, softly running the back of her hand along my forehead. "The bad news is, I'm not sure if it's really morning, or what day it is for that matter. The good news is," she started as she ran with the back of her hand off of my forehead and down my left cheek. "Your fever finally broke." "How bad?" I asked, referring to my state when I'd been asleep. "You were only calm when Alira was present, or Aline was present, or I was sitting with you," she answered. "Thank you," I said as I took her hand in mine, slowly sitting up as to not be on her lap any longer. "Just doing what I could, sir," she said evenly as she found her feet and made for the door. The room was small and covered in white sheets and white curtains, one of the private medical rooms if I was correct. There was only one bed and one door that could be locked from the outside. I got to my feet quickly, catching her hand as she attempted to walk away. She stopped and turned to face me. I could tell her emotions were in no small amount of confused frenzy. "The others will want to know you're awake," she whispered, tugging away, but I held her firm. "The others can wait a while longer," I responded softly. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to walk away again. "Come back to bed," I said, almost surprised by the longing in my voice. She turned briskly, her hair whirling about as she did. Her slender form was covered only by a thin gown, and I assumed no small amount of bandages beneath. Even like this, she took my breath away. "Is that an order, sir?" she slurred relaxingly. "No," I answered briskly as I offered her my hand once again. She took it, and I drew her close, kissing her softly. Her hands were against my bare chest, and my arms wrapped around her. We carefully found ourselves back in bed, and I held her in my arms, feeling my strength returning. I drew my power from protecting those I cared about. I understood that now. Fears, my men, the citizens of this fortress, and Alira, especially Alira. That was a cause that I would fight for. A cause for which I'd even hazard returning to that dark place. Bridget recognized her own weakness, where Aline recognized Bridget's strength. In the end, they were both wrong, in a way. And oh so right. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 6, continued. Bridget, betrayal. Blinding light was never the first thing one wanted to see upon awakening. Then again, it was better than absolute darkness. Bridget was sore, weary, and less than willing to get out of bed. "So, she lives," Aline's cool voice said from a chair to Bridget's right. She sat up quickly, throwing her comfort to the wind as she looked around the room. White. Everything was white. Which really must have been a bitch to keep clean, considering all the blood usually present in a hospital room. "Your injuries were minor, yet you slept for days," Aline said passively, looking at the wall beyond her. "Someone stumbled upon something prematurely. Eh, Bridget?" She purred the last statement, a bit uncharacteristically as she stood. "You should kill me," Bridget gasped, surprised at her own words. "At least imprison me," she said quickly, backpedaling. "Now why would we go and do a thing like that?" Aline asked, softly as she took a seat on the side of the bed. "Because I will betray you," she whispered, staring at the sheets. "Do you want to betray us?" "I'm beginning to think that my wants are irrelevant," Bridget muttered, looking down. "Do you want to betray us?" she repeated forcefully. Silence followed as Bridget stared at the all-too-clean white sheets. Aline placed her hand on Bridget's chin, bringing up her gaze. There was a sense of hopelessness swirling around in her emerald green eyes, yet Aline's radiated only strength. Bridget's heart said no, but her soul refused her choice. "No," she whispered. "Then don't." With that, Aline stood, turned, and left, leaving Bridget alone with her thoughts.
Perfect. Sometimes everything is just right, but it is so preciously fleeting. Even I enjoyed that brief moment in the library. If only they could have stayed there forever. They couldn't, of course. We wouldn't have much of a story if they had. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6, continued. Caden, it's been a long day. Commander? Fears practically slurred as he sauntered into the large room, feigning a salute. It was ornate, though for once I enjoyed it. There were 2 large couches meant for 3 people. Fears had once joked that the red velvet lining was made of dyed puppy fur, and the stuffing, well, the stuffing was made of the back hair of angels. Fears sighed as he dropped onto the couch adjacent to ours, sinking into the cushions. I reclined comfortably, head against a pillow, feet propped up against a golden painted wooden arm of the couch, and Alira's head resting on my mostly exposed chest. I wore my officer's pants, a thin blanket draped over Alira and me. And otherwise, we wore only bandages. It was damningly cold outside, but a royally large fire burned in the hearth, forward from the center of the couches. From the fire's point of view, Alira and I were dead center. Fears' couch was to the right, and an overly large one-person chair was to the left. The warmth washed over us in waves as I stroked Alira's blonde hair, staring up at the deep blue painted ceiling. Books surrounded us and a great many large wooden shelves that lined the walls from ground to ceiling. The books, of course, were the kind of scenery one expected when they requisitioned the library for important research. A lie, of course, but I hadn't cared or attempted to stop Fears when he put in the request. We'd survived hell, and God be damned, we were going to get some rest. Alira and I had wound our way to the library over an hour ago, and spent the time in the almost silence, enjoying nothing but the comfort of each other's bodies. She wore blessedly little under the large blanket. Bandages, my unbuttoned jacket, and some thin cloth shorts that I really doubted counted as shorts. The door cracked open tentatively as Fears reclined his head back, and I looked over my shoulder to the left to see who disturbed our sanctuary. It was Bridget. Even with the fire blazing, I felt a chill travel through my veins, my unoccupied fist clenching from nervous energy. I didn't know why Bridget had caused that reaction in me, but I sensed that something wasn't quite right. "There's my +1. Fears almost yawned, beckoning for Bridget to enter. "I heard there was a party," Bridget asked, closing the door softly behind her. "There." I bit back a retort as Alira ran a calming hand down my chest. "Certainly is," I finished after far too long of a pause. "And you are most welcome." I did my best not to convey the tension in my voice. "It's okay," Alira whispered, feeling my muscles tensing beneath her. "I've got you." She trailed off, running lines across my chest with her fingers. "Silly boy." Against all reason, her statement calmed me, and returned the comforting warmth of the fire. Bridget strode over, stopping in front of Fears' couch, hands on hips indignantly. "You going to let me have my couch?" she asked. "Your couch?" he asked, groggily opening his eyes to face her, standing above him. Her outfit consisted of about the same amount of cloth as Alira's, only the small short shirt and shorts she were deep blood red, rather than the cool Alathian blue. "Yes, my couch, that you've been so generously keeping warm for me," she finished as Fears smiled slyly, reaching up and pulling her down on top of him. They wrestled around, laughing with each other for a moment, before he grabbed the back of her head and kissed her passionately. They settled down as he pulled the blanket from the back of the couch down to rest on top of them. Before long, the last expected member of the party walked slowly into the room, softly shutting the door behind her. Inviting the Lord's daughter to his stolen library was probably not the best of ideas. But then again, invading Alpha's lair was far from the wisest of decisions, and I'd done that with little hesitation. This couldn't have been much more dangerous. She said nothing, walking past us in a white nightgown with a silk robe over the top of it. The material dragged behind her as she took a seat on the thick red and gold designed rug that rested beneath the couches. She rested her head back and against the cushions of my couch, breathing out a shaky sigh. I reached down with my right hand. It was amazing how quickly I'd come to think of her as a child. That tended to happen with newer recruits, regardless of the fact that she was my age. "You did well," I said warmly. She nodded slowly, tears threatening to roll free from her moist eyes. "He would have wanted you to live," I said, referencing Indira, as she nodded again. "We live because he sacrificed. Enjoy the life he earned us. It's the only way we can respect his memory," I whispered, brushing away a fallen tear with my thumb. "He would have wanted you to smile," I finished suggestively, adding a smirk of my own. She smiled weakly in return, and I gave her a small wink and shook her head softly. "That's a start." Her smile turned more genuine before the door burst open with a slam. "God damn it!" Fears cursed, turning to the door exasperatedly. "Who the hell?" He cut off as he noticed a lean, sleek form in the doorway. She took a few steps into the room, letting the door swing closed behind her. We all stiffened for a moment, getting ready to jump to attention, maybe attempt to explain ourselves, but I knew that would have been futile. That being said, I remained silent, waiting for her to speak. "Important research, huh?" she asked, stepping further towards the couches. She wore her uniform, crisp and put together, not a hair out of place. She was elegant, and really hard to lie to. "Yes, ma'am," Fears stuttered. "Shut up, Corporal," she silenced him with a glare before reaching back behind her head and undid the bun her hair had been stuck in. Her silvery blonde hair cascaded down her shoulders as she shook it loose. She unbuttoned her jacket, making her way to the chair as it slid off of her onto the ground, revealing a bandage wrap that covered only her chest. She unbuttoned her pants, stepping out of them as she drew closer. "I have some important research of my own," she sighed. She wore only skin-tight cloth leggings beneath. She stopped by the couch, looking over to me briefly. "I see I've just lost my sparring partner," she said with an almost playful smile. We all stared at her, jaws dropped with question marks for eyes, as she sunk into the huge chair, taking a blanket from the top and covering herself, only after sprawling out in a most undignified way. "What?" she asked, looking over at us before giving a very feline stretch and curling up against the couch. "It's been a very long day," she yawned. We all sat in a silence, nothing but the popping wood and pattering rain to interrupt our collective awe. "No, Corporal," she said out of the blue, not even facing Fears, though he looked as if he'd been about to say something. "But Elaine," he started. "When we leave this room," she said, turning to face him, "this," she gestured with her finger in a small circle, "never happened." It would have almost been right for her to purr as she once again curled up against the couch. Silence resumed, and we all relaxed, and I took up stroking Lyra's hair as she once again began drawing invisible patterns on my chest with her fingers. The fire crackled, the rain pattered, and for a time, everything was perfect. I closed my eyes, hearing something strange in the distance. Was that a howl? No, I thought to myself, holding Lyra tightly, her warm body intertwined with mine. Everything was perfect.
Oh, Alpha, the poor man, or thing, or whatever it was that he was, he had been fighting this war longer than most, predated in life by only a few select individuals. Immortality was not meant for everybody, for though his body remained young, his soul had grown sickly and old. He needed rest, but not just any kind of rest, the rest that only the sweet embrace of death could provide. I suppose someday he'd find it. After all, even I wasn't meant to live forever. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6. Continued. Alpha. Nothing is ever perfect. "Don't get me wrong. I do not love what I do," Alpha said, pacing around the small blood-filled room. He turned to Levain, hanging on the wall, blood trickling steadily from the bottoms of his feet. "You look confused," Alpha exclaimed, walking towards the center of the room and turning his body towards him. "Allow me to explain. When one kills, they break a great many things. The victim is broken in several ways, ending in the spirit being broken away from the body. It breaks the killer too, though. A small piece of you that was larger once tells you that it is wrong to kill," Alpha said in a flurry of tumbling hand motions. "This, at the end of the day, is terrible, but it amounts to nothing in reference to me. I do so much more than kill. I hunt, torture, fracture, shatter, and obliterate not only the bodies of my victims, but the mind and the soul as well," he whispered almost to himself. "Once upon a time, there was something in me that made me hesitate. But that was so long ago. Typically, one would apologize for their actions in a confession, but I need no apologies, only for you to understand," he sighed. "There is a place and a time beyond this war, a place untouched, a utopia, if you will, and where all is as it should be." He turned away from Levan, looking up towards the ceiling. "I do not belong there. I belong here, in the soot, blood, grime, and entrails that line the path to the end," he growled lightly. "It is what I was born to do, and I do not like what I do." He turned, thrusting his arms toward the ceiling. "I do what must be done because some fucking buddy has to do it," he roared. "If your god does not understand that, then surely he is not a god." Alpha pointed accusatorily. Levan groaned softly in response to the crescendo of statements, but said nothing. "My dear boy," Alpha said, almost to himself, walking right up to Levan and standing at about the height of his diaphragm, hanging from the ceiling as he was. "It is a gritty and dirty reality, but it's one view that even Aline would agree with me on. There is no such thing as perfection," he growled, shaking his head as he drove his hands slowly into the former priest-to-be, reaching beyond the ribcage and grasping the man's heart. "There is no such thing as perfection, because nothing is ever perfect," he growled again, pulling the heart clear from the man's body. Blood trickled from a gash that his claws had left on one of the ventricles. He'd tried so hard to get it out clean this time. "Case in point," he whispered to himself, tossing the heart aside into the pool with a plop. He closed his eyes, reaching his right hand out in front of him as a small fiery image of an open door appeared. As always, he couldn't see what was on the other side, for the surface of the portal affected his eyes as thick warped glass. Alpha took a deep breath and walked through, landing in one of the many caverns of his lair. He could feel a thrill rising in his blood as he walked along the stone floor, his wet boots still echoing against the stone. It was high time that the real fun began.
Subtle manipulations leading to the breaking of someone's mind. Reminders of his departed wife on the field of battle, subliminal messaging in the sound of screams, or even the releasing of certain birds to chirp a certain way at certain times of the day. Alpha was a master of the mind and the manipulation of it. His knowledge, of course, came from another time, a place far ahead of the primitive science of Varen's time. Even I could learn a thing or two from him, though perhaps some knowledge is best left unknown. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6 continued. Caden. More men. "To put it bluntly, we need more men," Varen said, with his air of command following him like a dark cloud. "Yes, Father, but where in the hell are we going to get them?" Rain asked bluntly. "We're not going there," he said, pointedly, gesturing towards the map splayed out on the table in the center of the room. I sat in a simple stone chair, ornamented with carvings and with a blue cloth hanging over the back. The thing was purposely a bit too large for any human being. The effect was supposed to make men a bit more humble in these meetings of strategy. I didn't really know if it worked. Fears, who sat to my right, had once suggested just having all the generals dress as women. Lord Varen had smiled at the suggestion at least. Now all the generals, aside from the leader of the guard, were dead, and the humor was gone. Aline sat across the table from me. Fears to my right, and to my left Varen and Rain stood facing him in confrontation. The argument was valid from both sides. There remained only one village that I hadn't been sent to recruit from. It was the largest and likely by far had the most recruitable men and willing men of any of the villages. I would have left with a sizable, battle-ready force. The one caveat to that was shown by the map. Each village was marked by a small blue flag. The castle had the largest flag and rested in the far west. The village was on the opposite end of the map in the east, a vast stretch of forest between the two. At a decent pace, 2 or 3 men could make it there in a few days, provided that they didn't run across any trouble. Unfortunately, the map revealed a lot of trouble between the 2 locations. Every skirmish that I'd gotten into was marked on the map by a red X. An army of X's surrounded and grew from the epicenter that was Volkrith. The running theories were that either Alpha was keeping us from the village as best as he could by engaging any party that got too close, or Volkrith was gone. Nothing but smoke and ash and corpses remained. I tended to believe the second, but desperate times... "Caden will go," Aline said softly from her regal yet refined position on the chair. I glanced at her with only a small amount of surprise as I studied the map with my elbows resting on my knees, my right hand absently stroking my chin. Varen looked to Aline with rage in his eyes. This endless fighting was robbing him of his sanity. I couldn't blame the man, and this recent battle had put him on edge. Too many had died. "Well, I can't stop him," Varen growled, turning towards me and then back towards Rain. "And this impotent wretch of a daughter seems to be very intent on dying, so she can bloody well go with him." "She's mine to command now, as per our agreement. I allowed you to send her with Caden to the den of the beast, but this time I need her here," Aline responded coolly. "Well, apparently I no longer hold any significance around this forsaken place," he snarled as he turned away from Rain and stalked out of the room, his torn, tattered, and bloody cape billowing out behind him. Rain exhaustedly took her seat at the edge of the table, slumping down. She looked much older and much more capable than the girl I'd taken into the woods. "I don't know what's happening," Rain sighed, "but that is not my father." "You're correct, after a fashion anyway," Aline responded softly. "What do you mean by that?" Rain asked, returning to a more dignified pose. "A discussion for later," Aline brushed her off. "For now, it would seem, Caden's excursion should be at the forefront of our agenda." "Indeed," I chimed in, aiding Aline in her change of subject. The conversation was one that she and Rain would have to have alone. "I would hear more of my journey," I finished, looking to Aline. "It's quite simple. We need more men, and they might have men. Go get them," she finished, standing up as if to adjourn our meeting. I stood as well. "Not much of a plan," I commented as she turned to walk away. "Caden, you are a clever man. I need Alira and Rain. Take 2 others. Bridget and Fierce are to cover it. You leave at dawn. Other than that, the commission is completely yours," she said, walking towards the door briskly. "We leave 5 minutes after dawn," I shouted after her, standing and crossing my arms. She turned to face me, a sly smile playing at her lips. "I thought I'd at least decide one thing about my mission," I finished. "And so you have," she almost laughed as she rushed out of the door. Something had her attention, and it wasn't this meeting. Fear stood to leave as well, leaving only Rain still seated, one hand covering her eyes, and the other massaging her right temple. "I'll tell Bridget to be ready. 5 minutes after dawn?" Fears asked. "On the dot, Corporal." He did a half-hearted salute before leaving. I walked over to Rain, where she still sat, looking as exhausted as we all felt. I was beginning to have a soft spot for this recruit. She would make a remarkable soldier. I could just feel it. I placed my left hand on her shoulder and gripped her reassuringly. We are called because we are stronger than the others," I breathed. "It's not easy," she whispered. "The right thing rarely is." I left her to her thoughts, closing the doors behind me.
Interrogations! My personal specialty. Well, one of my specialties anyway. Gardening, riding, flaying the skins off of pheasants, fishing, and the eating of peanut butter. I have a particular proclivity for the consumption of creamy crushed nuts. Peanuts, of course. Lean and Alpha were rather skilled at it too, unsurprisingly. More excitingly, however, Fears and Caden turned out to be rather good at it as well. The interrogating, not the peanuts. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6 continued. Caden, Aline, and Bridget. Interrogations. I approached my quarters with a pleasant feeling that they wouldn't be empty. It helped offset the foreboding I felt at the thought of tomorrow's mission. I turned down the last corridor before the door to my quarters and I felt my excitement turn to ash in my veins as the dark music began to return. I grew dizzy as blackness began to engulf me. I broke into a dead run, collapsing against the door to my quarters before fumbling the handle open and stumbling across the threshold. It was like being dragged into the hell that lurked inside of my mind. I fell to my knees, yelling and grabbing my hair, covering my ears with my forearms, but the music wouldn't fade, and light wouldn't return. I felt true, primal fear at the thought of being returned to that place. Suddenly, the darkness began to retreat as I felt a hand running through my hair, and another on the back of my head. The side of my face rested on thin cloth that had the warmth of flesh pressed close behind it. I wrapped my arms around the woman before me, clinging to her like a light in the darkness. She held me by my left shoulder and the back of my head. My right arm was wrapped around her lower back, and my left clung to her side, just below her ribcage, below her breast. The music continued to fade away as she whispered, "It's all right. I'm here. It's all right." I slowly relaxed my grip on her as I became more sure that the darkness wouldn't return. I felt shame at my behavior, but when I looked up into her eyes, I saw only worry and a remarkable amount of understanding. "She warned me that this could happen to you," she breathed softly, though she did not tell me why. "Aline," I guessed with a matter-of-fact tone as I regained my composure and stood, never once breaking eye contact. Alira nodded in the affirmative, but said nothing. I turned away from her, leaning against a wall and staring into the dim fire that burned in the heart of the lantern on my bedside table. "There's something that I'm not being told," I hypothesized. "There's nothing that I haven't told you," Alira responded, taking a seat on the bed. "Tell me," Aline screamed, slashing her nails across the prisoner's face, with much the same effect as claws. Normally, she hated losing her composure like this, but certain situations called for a certain personality type. "Tell you what?" he roared in response from a seated position tied to a stone chair. They were in a very small questioning chamber, made of bland stone, with an assortment of tools on the table. "You know exactly what," she hissed, mere inches from his bruised and bloodied face. The guards were waiting outside, and they were not likely to enter, considering their orders not to interfere. "No, I don't," he spat, punctuating the statement by actually spitting in her face. Blood and mucus dripped down her features. She closed her eyes for a second, before grabbing him by the sides of the face, rearing her head back and crashing her forehead into the bridge of his nose. "What are you hiding?" Fears asked, reclining in a small wooden chair across the room from the sparsely clothed Bridget. Her upper body was completely uncovered, and her feminine area was hidden only by that damned, almost see-through red cloth. He kept his cool regardless, acting as though it didn't faze him. She seemed to like that. She looked down at herself for a second, as if considering an answer to his question. She paused before looking up and giving a sly smile. "Not much." He'd come to brief her on the mission and had caught her disrobing before bed. She hadn't minded, judging by the way she'd continued after gesturing for him to sit. He hadn't minded either. "Oh, come on now, Bridget," he said, uncrossing his arms and leaning forward, clasping his hands between his knees. So far, she'd been putting on quite a show, and though the dim lighting hid some things that he'd rather seen, it definitely lent to the mood. "Easy there," she said, sauntering up to him before pushing his shoulders back and straddling him in the chair. It creaked, but did not seem willing to surrender to their combined weight. "I think I'm supposed to enjoy myself a little first." She knew he hadn't meant that kind of cum, but he was fun to play with. "All right now," Fears said firmly as he looked up to make eye contact. He willed himself to stay firm. In his resolve, that was. Her smell was intoxicating, clouding his mind, making him want only her, but he needed answers. The warmth of her thighs burned through his clothes. The vision of her slender form drew him further down the rabbit hole, but he needed answers. He prepared to speak, but she wouldn't have it. "Shh," she whispered, placing her right index finger on his lips. To his credit, she didn't even feel a lump under his clothing. "Just play along," she whispered into his ears, the warmth of her breath chasing away his strength. "No," he gasped through the spell. "Nothing?" I asked, a bit incredulously, turning to face her seated on the bed as she was. "You'd suspect me?" she asked, standing with an innocent smile playing on her lips. I knew she was hiding in some information from me. The degree of its importance was the only variable. Yeah, I know, I said as she pushed me up against a wall. The audacity, I whispered in mock exclamation. Well, what are you gonna do? She asked, finding the bottom hem of my shirt. Interrogate me? She lifted it slowly. I could feel her cold hands running up my stomach. It was stunningly alluring. My shirt was off, and her cold hands ran the length of my chest, her nails softly digging into my pectorals as she bit my ear playfully, whispering sarcastically, Torture me? Obviously, Aline responded, going over to the low table and running her hands over all the different tools at her disposal. But you can't. That's not what you people do, he yelled back, fear making his voice quiver as blood continued to gush from his newly broken nose. I'll admit that torture is usually beyond us, but I'm tired of dealing with you, General, she said, snatching up a small knife and returning to the man, lifting his chin with the flat of the blade. And I really want to keep this castle, she finished with a threatening smile. But why? Bridget asked in confusion as fears lifted her as he stood, dropping her onto the bed unceremoniously. I usually play the fool, Fear said, crossing his arms to bar her from him. I'm the sarcastic funny guy, comic relief even. What? Bridget began to ask. Just listen, he interrupted. I play the part because the lives we live are depressing, and for all their bluster, the vast majority of these people would slit their own throats as a small mercy to their tormented souls. He considered his next words for a moment. Yes, I'm pretty sure even Kate and Aline would lose their collective proverbial shit. He took a seat next to her. I tell you all this because you know that I might not be as stupid as I often pretend to be, nor as oblivious. I don't, she started. Don't lie to me, he stated firmly, locking eyes with her. What could I possibly have for you? She asked, kissing my chest softly, a valiant attempt to distract me. A lot, I'm sure, I breathed as my heart rate refused to calm itself. But right now, it's information I'm after. Oh? She asked, standing on her tiptoes to meet my eyes. Is that all you're after? Well, I began, holding her with my right arm around her lower back. I grabbed the back of her hair with my left hand, pulling her head back. Her mouth gaped slightly as I looked down into her eyes. Maybe not all, I added, leaning down and kissing her neck just above the collarbone. Her nails dug into my back as I worked my way up her neck, before pressing my lips against hers passionately, closing my eyes. I loosened my grip on her hair and ran my fingers through it rather than pulling. She pushed me back against the wall, and I hit with enough force to knock the breath from me. She was deceptively strong. She pressed herself against me, hands on my chest, nails digging into me as she pressed her lips lightly against my ear. I carefully braced her weight by pressing my hands against her hips. I'll never talk, she whispered, punctuating each word with a soft kiss. Then we'll have to settle for screams, Aline responded, calmly digging the small knife between the index and middle knuckle on the man's hand. He threw his head back, letting loose a string of curses. What the fuck is he planning? She screamed over his pain. Never, he responded before she twisted the knife, causing his shouts to turn into a pained yell rather than actual words. That doesn't even make grammatical sense, she screamed back tauntingly. Sure it does, Bridget stuttered defensively. Is a perfectly proper sentence. No, it's not, Fears responded coldly, taking a seat behind her. Talk to me. What do you expect me to tell you? She asked, exasperatedly turning towards him. She was still devoid of clothing, but neither of them seemed to be noticing anymore. Everything, he responded, narrowing his eyes. He hadn't had the chance to shave recently, and the dim light only gave him a more savage appearance. Anything. His bright blue eyes glinted by the firelight. Fears, I don't even know who I am, she pleaded softly, placing her hands on the side of her head. I don't know where I'm from. Fuck, I'm lucky I know my own damn name. She stood suddenly, striding to the back of the room. I don't know where I belong. I don't know who I belong to. Hell, I'm pretty sure if I tried hard enough, I might be able to breathe fire. Fears, She started but didn't finish. Fears was right in front of her as she turned around. Her heart jumped as he placed his fingers against her lips this time. Her eyes widened as he gazed into them. There was something there that she couldn't quite place. You belong to no one, he said solidly without blinking. My choices are hardly my own, she responded, swatting his hand aside abruptly. Then whose are they? he asked with force, placing his hand on her upper chest, pushing her back against the wall. His? He asked, gesturing down with his eyes. What? She began to ask, before looking down and seeing that his hand rested inside the bloody handprint. She'd forgotten it was there. At the end of this life, however close or far it may be, you'll have to answer for what you've done. And love, trust me when I say, I was just following orders. Isn't gonna be good enough for anyone's higher power. He turned to leave, his hand falling from her chest, enabling her to breathe again. He made it to the door, almost to the door, almost leaving her completely alone. Help me, she cried after him. She wasn't one to beg, but she was begging. He stopped, turning and leaning against the doorway. Could you really? He started. I mean, do you think you really could? Could what? She asked quizzically. Breathe fire, he said with a flourish. I don't know, she stammered a response. You'll need to be honest with me, he said, stepping towards her. Okay, you can't hide things from me. Okay, you can't just stop telling me because it's convenient. Okay, and one more thing, he whispered, placing the back of his hand onto her cheek. She leaned into its warmth. You can't let him take you. Okay, she breathed as she placed her hand in his. Stay with me, she asked before he pulled her into his embrace. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, chasing away the cold night. Do that for me, and I'll stay, he whispered as he kissed the top of her head. He took in her scent, an alluring combination of smoke covered vaguely by a cinnamon taint. And we'll find out if you can breathe fire. Together. Never, I asked as she clawed down the middle of my chest. Never, she whispered, shaking her head, so close to my ear that it caused her nose to rub against my skin softly. You're sure there's nothing I could do to make you talk? I asked hesitantly, flipping us around until she was pressed against the wall, my hands holding at her wrists. She struggled playfully before biting her lower lip and looking up at me, shaking her head. You're not sure? I asked. She shook her head no, with renewed vigor. She lifted her knee and it caught me solidly in the stomach. Could have been worse, I reflected as I doubled over coughing. She was on top of me before I could recover, knocking me onto the bed. I don't want any secrets between us, she whispered, leaning down until her hair tickled against my face, canopying all around us until all I could see was her beautifully sharp, dramatic features and her radiating blue eyes. But you'll have to give me something first. What? I asked softly as my hands gripped her by her slender hips. She leaned down until I was surrounded by the smell of her hair. I breathed her in as her lips rested softly against my right ear. I'll be yours, she whispered. She hesitated. Will you be mine? She was asking for commitment. I flipped her onto her back softly and held myself above her, knees beside her thighs, my left hand beside her head, my right stroking some of her hair behind her left ear. She looked up at me nervously as I stroked her cheek softly with my thumb, following the bone. She was too damn beautiful. I am yours, and you are mine, I promised. She smiled, positively beaming, and I swore that her eyes glowed as she wrapped her hands around the back of my head, pulling me into a slow, soft, and wonderfully long kiss. I fell over on my side as she shoved me, softly, not to break the kiss, as her hands held to the sides of my face and mine wrapped around her, still clothed back. Before long, it was a wrestling match. The bed was our arena, as clothes were ripped and tossed from the sides of the bed in shreds. We were together that night, and I felt as though nothing could pull us apart. Take my tongue, the man gasped from his seated position, and I'll have nothing left to speak with. Aline held a pair of metal tongs outstretched in front of her, opening and closing them with a soft metallic clank. I don't need you to speak, she answered softly as she approached him. Then why? He asked. He looked up dizzily, blood pouring from a great many wounds as he coughed. Why all of this? Because, she said, taking a seat in front of him, I had to know for sure. What? He sputtered. Had to know what? The truth. Of just how far I'd fallen, she spoke as she looked to the ground, downtrodden. I'd been told by a friend once that I'd know when I crossed the line, once it's already been crossed. That's bloody useful, the man groaned. That, she said, picking up for a second, is exactly what I told him, she exclaimed, slapping his thighs. He moaned in protest. Bloody useful indeed, she finished more softly. Kill me, the man whispered. Oh? Aline asked, being drawn back from her reflection. Seems that if I live long enough, I'll only become you.
Ah, then where would your place be after all is said and done?
I wouldn't have one, he grunted.
Indeed, you would not,
she whispered. She whipped out a small knife that the man hadn't even seen and flashed it across his throat. For the longest moment, it looked as though nothing had happened. Then his throat opened and blood flowed freely as the man coughed and bucked violently.
Indeed, I do not,
she whispered to herself as she stood, wiping the few droplets of blood from her blade onto her pants. The man's struggles died as she left the room. All of that, and he'd actually, truly, known nothing at all. Chapter 6. Continued. Alpha. The Attack. Alpha stood in the moonless night, rain drenching through his thick coat. Had he not been fully changed at the time, shivering would have been inevitable. He closed his eyes, lifting his nose to the wind, smelling the rain-soaked earth underneath, the overpowering scent of decay. His forces stood all around him, all of them. He had only a few Anaran corpsmen remaining, and even fewer Anaran sabers, and his exo had been slain by Caden a while back. His replacement was hardly qualified, but it barely mattered. He had thousands of undead creatures loping about the large clearing, but their fighting skills were negligible. All of this mattered not. His plans hinged on one person, one detail, and he knew she would not fail him. Forced from his underground fortress, he didn't want to discuss the details. He had one option remaining. In 3 days, it would begin, and end, with the burning of Varen's precious little castle.
The memories of the others, as they would be dubbed, are a tricky and fascinating thing. The mind is hardly capable of handling the enormous shock and discrepancies caused by fading in and out of mission as they do. Thus, a self-defense mechanism, complete in almost absolute memory block. The mind cordons off that which it cannot handle, at least not at first. With practice, almost all things become possible, as is shown clearly by those such as Aline, Alpha, and even Alira. Try and access it too soon, however, and, well, the observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6. Continued. Caden. Memories. I swore I could hear the rain pattering softly outside as we lay entwined with one another. Our legs were tangled together, and her thighs rested against mine. My left arm was beneath her head as she rested, staring into my eyes. I returned the stare, running my hand along her face, onto her shoulders, down the side of her chest, and further still to her hip. We'd been silent for what must have been forever, but only felt like a few minutes.
There really is only so much I can tell you,
she whispered, regret filling her voice. I responded slowly as her voice pulled me from my trance.
The darkness that comes from you, it's from the wolf, from your proximity to him.
Then why doesn't it ever affect Aline?
The only thing that keeps it at bay is the strength of your beliefs. When it threatens to overpower you, you have to concentrate on why you are a Lathian, why you fight for our side.
But that doesn't make any sense. I shook my head lightly. Only you and Aline can chase it away.
Apparently. Or at least two of your reasons for being who you are.
No, I began to argue, but was quickly silenced by her left index finger pressing against my lips.
Don't,
she whispered.
I know this because I've been there before. Been through what you're going through. I thought that she hesitated. Aline told me that it would happen to you too.
That's impossible, I retaliated. I remember suddenly a searing white pain pierced through my mind.
Caden,
she almost shouted as I grimaced.
Don't,
she cupped her hand against the side of my face. The pain receded until I could open my eyes again.
You wouldn't remember. Trust me. You have to trust me.
Fortunately, I did.
All that matters is that we are your anchors right now. That's nothing to be ashamed of. If the darkness returns, when the darkness returns, just think of Aline.
She paused before leaning forward to kiss me.
Think of me,
she whispered, the heat of her breath against my lips.
Think of us, me and you.
She kissed me again, relaxing my mind. I had learned nothing new, and had been left with more questions than answered, but right then, in that moment, I had Alira, and that was all that seemed to matter.
Betrayal, purposeful or accidental, for the greater good or for selfishness, is never easy for those of conscience. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6 continued. Rain, the Lord's daughter. Rain sat alone in the library, the fire dead in the heath, and the happiness gone from the room with it. She had a large book in her lap and skimmed the pages, absorbing none of the information, practically turning the pages on a timer. Her father was going insane, but it was more than that. He was under something, or something was in him. Either way, the man was no longer the father she'd known. History, Aline observed from behind the large chair Rain occupied. Coincidentally, it was the same one Aline had been curled up in the night before. A useful subject, if used correctly. Rain jumped and drew in a quick breath at the sound of Aline's voice. She hadn't even heard her enter. Yeah, Rain agreed half-heartedly. Wasn't she supposed to stand at attention or something? She couldn't make herself care. I get the feeling that you aren't reading, Aline commented as Rain closed the book slowly. How did you know? 36 seconds and 6 breaths, Aline purred, coming around the chair carefully, running her right hand along it as she circled. Huh? Rain asked, following her with her gaze. The time, before you turn the page, she said, dropping into a squat and resting her hand on Rain's thighs softly. 30 seconds and 6 breaths. I didn't even realize, she breathed. Most people don't. Aline began, tapping her right index finger on the side of her head. But our internal clocks are a lot better at this whole time thing, keeping time. Are a lot better at this whole keeping time thing than we give them credit for. Clocks? Rain asked, confused by the unfamiliar terminology. Oh, never mind, Aline commented nonchalantly. I'm here to talk to you about a coup. Or a coup de grace. Maybe just a coup. Or both. You're in the wrong place, then, Rain growled. It hadn't been on purpose, but the comment had angered her. Why's that? Aline asked, standing up and walking to the nearest couch and falling into it. I'm talking with the would-be lord. You're talking with the lord's daughter, Rain corrected softly. All the better, Rain responded with practiced coldness. How so? Rain asked, prompting Aline to stand again. Because that means that you are in the highest and the best place to recognize that he is no longer him. Aline squatted in front of her again. Look at me, she said in a soft voice. Rain looked up from her closed book, slowly meeting Aline's gaze. There was a maternal quality to it. Aline knew how to press an advantage like a knife into a wound. Come with me, once the others leave, and we will confront him. Just the two of us. He will see reason. They both knew he wouldn't. He will go peacefully. No, he wouldn't. Okay, Rain whispered, looking Aline in those all-too feline eyes, searching for deception. She found none. Okay, Aline whispered in return before standing and resting a soft hand on Rain's left cheek. I'll come get you when it's time. She left without another word, leaving Rain with her conscience tying knots in her stomach. It has to be done, she whispered to herself. It has to be done, she repeated. It has to be done. Aline's voice whispered through the otherwise silent library. Rain shivered bodily before curling up and letting a troubled sleep take her.
Awakening from sleep is often an odd and sometimes deceptive thing. I once awoke from a dream of running from vampires, only to walk downstairs and find a werewolf in my fridge that tried to eat me, before awakening again. Not that I haven't ever found a werewolf in my fridge. The odd thing wasn't the werewolf per se, but rather that I usually remember putting them there. And they are rather dead before I do it, thus rather incapable of eating my face when I open their cold metal caskets to retrieve my leftovers. This is to say, Bridget should have been more aware of deception. Not that Alpha always needed her asleep to influence her mind. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6 continued. Bridget. Have them both. She woke from dreams of searing light and harsh piano harmonies blaring through her mind. She sat up screaming her agony, covered in sweat and tears. She breathed heavily, holding herself with shaking arms. What in the holy hell had that been? She wondered as she tore herself from her bed. She wore nothing but her scars as she paced the cold stone floors, happy for the relief from the heat of her searing dreams. The handprint burned now more than ever. You are faltering. a voice said from behind her, warm and fatherly.
Yes,
Bridget responded confidently, turning around. What draws you to them? Alpha asked without a care. Is it the boy? He mused. Aline, perhaps.
Perhaps,
Bridget responded unbidden. You can have them both, you know, Alpha growled. Fears and what I offer.
Power,
Bridget whispered once again unbidden. She couldn't control herself. Yes. Make him love you, Alpha said with a small smile, and he will go wherever you go. Bridget turned, but he was already gone.
Do we even have a choice?
Bridget asked the silence. No, Alpha responded from somewhere within her mind. Bridget returned to her bed after peeling the soaked sheets away. She felt cold and alone. She didn't know if fears could help her. How could he, when she couldn't even control her own actions? In the end, she didn't know what would happen. She doubted that anyone really did, except him. The wolf always seemed to know, just like she was sure he knew where she, Caden, and Fears were going. At least he wouldn't be sacking the castle while they were gone. He needed her for that.
What would have happened had he said something else? I could always take a trip through my multiverse viewer, but that certainly takes all the fun out of speculating. There really was not a unilaterally better decision to make. I'll admit that I only discovered this after cheating and peeking in the viewer. I couldn't help it, okay? And I destroyed the viewer afterwards. Stupid device only shows a view of what could have happened anyway, and is absolutely incapable of affecting change without a time travel device. Even though I can't forget how to build the multiverse, I refuse to allow anyone access to time travel. That's partly how the event was theorized to have been caused, after all. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 6. Continued. Caden. Strange dreams. Bang. Explosions were all I could hear. I opened my eyes, but everything was a blur. I tried to listen, but I heard nothing more than a high-pitched ringing and the damn explosions. I concentrated when I opened my eyes this time, refusing to let the searing pain that flooded my mind stop me. I was looking down at my hands, holding some strange device. I was squatting with my back to a wall that had been reduced to rubble. The man to my left used a similar device that seemed to breathe fire and death with every bang. Gun. Firearm. I dimly recalled as pain exploded through my mind with more enthusiasm than it had previously. The earth shook beneath my feet from a larger explosion, as I heard more sections of the wall falling to dust. The pain seared through my mind, and it was damn near unbearable. Then I heard someone yelling beyond the sounds of everything else. Was that my voice? I recognized nothing here, though it all felt strangely strongly of deja vu. Caden! I heard the scream over the din of everything else. Alira? He stood at the main gate, securing Fears' armor, making sure all the straps were in place as Fears checked over Bridget. The men were in their usual blue-gray attire, with unusually thick cloaks. They wore small, dark brown, square backpacks that were probably filled with food, water, and basic first-aid supplies. It was all they would really need. Rain trudged through the muddy courtyard as an icy, wet breeze blew through her hair. It was damn cold without a cloak, but she needed to talk to Caden before he left. For whatever reason, she found herself trusting his moral judgment more than her own. Somehow, she just knew that he, at least, tried to be a decent man. I was still shaking off the effects of my previous night's dream. The scream had been Alira's, but she had been in the waking world, trying to pull me out of the dream that was apparently ripping my sanity to shreds. According to her, I had to do my best not to try and remember anything from before. Once again, our conversation had left me with more questions than answers, and I was in need of distraction. Luckily, it looked like Rain was going to offer me just that. Commander, she began as she came close enough to be heard over the howling wind. Caden, I responded nonchalantly, turning to her. You're not under my command today. She looked puzzled for a moment, but quickly recovered. Which I think just might be all the better. You look like you're in need of a friend more than an officer, I said as I thrust my untied gauntlet forward. She absently tied the leather straps. If you have a moment, she responded, nodding off towards her right as she finished. Well, the sun's barely rising, so yes, I think I do. I began walking in the direction she'd indicated, and she fell in step beside me. I waited for her to speak as we sloshed through the mostly barren courtyard. How do you decide what the right thing to do is? Usually, I asked. She nodded the affirmative. I trust my gut. So if my guts are nodding themselves in a million different directions. I've made the wrong choice? She sighed audibly. Look, I began, I'd love to tell you that right and wrong is black and white, easily distinguishable, but it's not. We live in a world of blurred lines and gray tones. Things are never clear-cut. I stopped walking, and she followed suit as she turned towards me. Lathians teach us that there is hardly ever right versus wrong, but rather an array of choices, one of which will benefit the most people and be most likely to have an overall profitable outcome. So I'm to choose the most utilitarian option, then? She replied with disdain. Not always, I responded with a sigh. I don't always. She looked at the ground, then back up at me. You didn't with Indera? No, I didn't, I said, smiling wistfully. So then how should I choose? She asked as frustration rose in her voice. I paused before answering. If you died tomorrow, what would you regret? I asked as she continued to stare at the ground. I drew a knife that I'd kept around my waist for a couple of days now. I held the knife by the hilt before tossing it in a flip and catching it by the blade. I placed the pommel beneath Brain's chin and lifted her gaze to meet my eyes. You'll live or die with your decisions. Just make sure you leave yourself a life worth living or a memory worth respecting. I dropped the knife and caught it by the section of the blade closer to the hilt. I pressed the flat against her barely armored chest and gripped her right shoulder. I pulled her so close that I was practically whispering in her ears. I know you'll make the right choice, I whispered before pulling back slightly, briefly resting my forehead on hers. Keep the knife, I finished in a louder tone as I pulled away, tapping her right shoulder before striding towards Fears and Bridget. By my count, the sun had risen almost 5 minutes ago. He left Rain to clumsily catch the knife as he walked away. She watched him go, cloak billowing behind him as the wind blew hard. It forced her to shiver and pull her arms around herself. When it had finally passed, Caden and the others were already out of the gate. She looked down at the knife for the first time since Caden had drawn it. She studied the plain and simple design until her eyes came to rest on the pommel, where a letter I was engraved with painstaking care. I for Indera, she thought to herself as she carefully tucked it at her waist. Her father would have never left a man behind as the wolf had commanded them to leave Indera. Unfortunately, Varen was no longer that man, and she knew it, just as she knew what had to be done.